There's nothing more frustrating than tracking your food, hitting your workouts, and all of a sudden you see the scales start to creep up and your stomach starts to look like maybe it's holding more water than it was a week ago. You might be thinking, what gives? Why is this happening to me? Why do I look puffy? Why are you not liking what you're seeing in the mirror? Inside today's episode, we're going to be talking about the plight commonly known as water retention.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
There's nothing more frustrating than tracking your food, hitting your workouts, and all of a sudden you see the scales start to creep up and your stomach starts to look like maybe it's holding more water than it was a week ago. You might be thinking, what gives? Why is this happening to me? Why do I look puffy? Why are you not liking what you're seeing in the mirror? And in many cases, there are different factors that can contribute to water retention, and those vary from electrolyte imbalances, hormone dysfunction, and more. Inside today's episode, we're going to be talking about the plight commonly known as water retention. To someone who's less informed about water retention, it can easily cause second guessing of your current plan or program and negative emotions that can definitely cause the screw it effect, which is typically when people just go off plan or go off the rails because they see scale weight creep up or they're holding a bit of water after exerting any type of effort. Now, when you're informed about normal fluctuations and their causes, water retention during dieting can still mess with your head, but the purpose of this podcast is to give you the education to understand how to manage that negative emotion and rumination with an objective set of eyes. And I think that can go a really, really long way. So besides just being a vanity thing, increased water retention can contribute to high blood pressure. And that's an important health consideration depending on the context. If someone is lean and otherwise healthy, the effect probably won't be super noticeable. But in the context of someone having, a history of being overweight, or maybe they're pre-diabetic, insulin resistant, history of high blood pressure or cardiovascular issues, water retention does have real potential to increase that blood pressure further. One of the factors contributing to blood pressure is just how much fluid volume you have within your arteries. And if there's more fluid, there's simply more volume pushing out against those arteries, potentially increasing blood pressure. So increased water retention doesn't generally just mean underneath the skin. Some of the causes we'll talk about increase whole body water retention, including even that of your arteries. Now, when it comes to root causes of water retention, there's three main hormones that control water balance in the body. These are a big part of the root cause considerations, and many, but not all, of the subsequent things that we're going to talk about in today's episode are influencing one or several of these three hormones. The first is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. This is also known as vasopressin or arginine vasopressin, and ADH is secreted by the posterior pituitary and acts at the level of the kidneys to reabsorb water back into circulation. There's a fun fact here. Alcohol inhibits the release of ADH, which is why sometimes you start peeing like nobody's business after a couple drinks. It's something that you may notice after alcohol. Now, obviously, water, sodium, and things like that can influence that effect as well. Aldosterone or aldosterone, normally released in situations of low blood pressure or dehydration, is important because it acts on the kidneys to increase sodium retention and potassium excretion. When more sodium is retained, it draws fluid with it and thereby causing water to be retained as part of that. When the heart senses higher arterial stretch than is necessary, as well as high systemic blood pressure, it releases ANP, which acts at the kidneys to increase their filtration rate, as well as excreting sodium and water, which has the effect of decreasing blood pressure as well. When we look at upstream causes, stress and high cortisol are definitely potential reasons for water retention. In an experiment known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, Ansel Keys led a study to look at the physiological effects of starvation. It involved 36 men over 6 months, and the men were doing hard physical labor and had baseline expenditures of around 3,200 calories. When the study began, they were cut to 1,500 calories and maintained the routine of hard labor. During the first months, the researchers noticed steady weight loss, usually around 2 to 4 pounds a week, depending on the individual. After about 2 months, however, weight loss became extremely non-linear, and the researchers noted that all of the men's scale weights would be stable for 1 to 3 weeks, and then one morning they'd wake up and they may even be many pounds lighter. This was called the whoosh effect, and anyone who's dieted extensively will know that sometimes this can happen, even if that study was a small sample size and maybe not necessarily perfect for all applications across nutrition coaching. This is something that occurred at random, but always occurred after a high-calorie meal. For example, at the halfway point of the study, the researchers gave them a 2,300 calorie meal in addition to their other calories, and everyone woke up 3 to 4 pounds lighter the next morning. You're dieting or you're calorie restricted and it's going well, but then all of a sudden you start to look worse. It's almost like you're puffier than you were before. And sometimes when you add additional food back in, sometimes known as refeeding, this can take care of it. So as you're dieting, you're going to have steadily increasing levels of basal cortisol, and mechanistically, one of the things that's causing the water retention in the situation is actually cortisol itself. Cortisol can bind to the receptor that aldosterone normally does and cause sodium and fluid retention. Interestingly, cortisol has been shown to inhibit ADH, the hormone that normally conserves water, but it's been shown that under the conditions of psychological stress, both cortisol and ADH increase significantly. The increases in ADH could contribute to what we're seeing here as well. So any situation where you have increased cortisol for longer periods of time, you might be retaining more water. Consistent poor sleep is another example of where this might occur or have an impact on cortisol and circadian rhythm. Another potential reason for water retention is going to be imbalances in sodium and potassium, because that consumption can vary. While many mechanisms of water retention from other causes are generated by increased retention of sodium at the kidney, it also makes sense that increasing the sodium coming in relative to what you used to consume will also potentially cause water retention. There are many mechanisms behind this, and to detail a couple, when you have a large amount sodium in the interstitial fluid, it's going to draw water in with it. But then when you have a large bolus dose of sodium that exceeds the current homeostatic set point of salt balance in the body, in order to excrete the excess sodium, the kidneys concentrate it for excretion. And how you increase the concentration of something is by removing liquid. So the kidney reabsorbs significant amounts of water to concentrate sodium for excretion, leading to excess body water conservation until the excess sodium is out, after which point it increases water excretion as well. Another reason for what we could be seeing with water retention is carbohydrate intake and the hormone insulin. If you're interested in learning more about insulin, I've covered it before in the podcast feed. You can just give it a quick search on Spotify or your favorite podcast channel. Chances are, if you've increased carbohydrate or had a high calorie meal, usually those have a boatload of sodium, which is going to influence water retention. But a lot of times when people refeed or eat higher calories, they're also consuming a very large amount of carbohydrate. Carbohydrates can increase water retention by a few different mechanisms. First, there's an increase in intracellular fluid, and that's largely due to glycogen storage, because when carbs are stored, they're stored with water. Second, and probably the real culprit of the puffiness or water retention, is the high insulin levels from the resulting large amount of carbohydrate will directly act at the kidney to increase sodium reabsorption. Chronic hyperinsulinemia also increases the action of aldosterone at the kidneys, so you have a 1-2 punch of sodium and therefore water retention. Another reason, and we see this sometimes with people who are beginners in their fitness journey, not necessarily people who have been doing it for a while, but not drinking enough water. When your body senses that it's low on fluid, it has many water conservation mechanisms in place. This involves all three of the hormones that I previously discussed earlier in the episode. So when the body senses low fluid, it's going to increase aldosterone and ADH and decrease ANP, switching on these different levers for increased fluid retention. So when you drink enough water, and I do have some hydration episodes on this if you do want to check out the science of hydration to learn more about how to do this properly. Some people do overconsume water without adequate electrolytes, and that can cause issues like headaches and other imbalances as well. Our next potential root cause of water retention is inflammation, because when inflammation is present, the body releases histamine. Histamine causes the gaps between cells of the capillary walls to widen. This is to make room for white blood cells to come and fight any infection that may be present in the body. This is completely normal during an acute injury and any type of swelling, but when you have systemic inflammation present, the same capillary wall widening can happen even without the presence of white blood cells. When the capillary walls widen, inevitably a bit of fluid will leak out into that interstitial space, which can contribute to or cause that puffy look that you're seeing. Other conditions that parallel systemic inflammation may also cause a 1-2 punch. So things like metabolic syndrome, for example, the hyperinsulinemia is causing sodium retention at the level of the kidney, plus the presence of systemic inflammation results in even more water retention. If you've had very overweight clients or people with significant metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, you may have noticed that when they first started losing fat, the initial water drop was much larger than average with their lifestyle, training, and nutrition changes. Another hormone to consider when it comes to water retention is estrogen. Estrogen mainly acts to lower the thermostat on when ADH releases. So normally ADH is secreted when plasma sodium reaches a certain level. Estrogen rises, it lowers the threshold of plasma sodium, which ADH is released. And remember that ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, conserves and retains body water. It also has a small effect on the renin-angiotensin system, which contributes to water retention as well. Progesterone, on the other hand, acts as a natural diuretic. So when a woman has hormonal imbalances, mainly the common occurrence of high estrogen relative to progesterone, which is typically higher estradiol and lower progesterone, if you're looking at that in serum labs, she's going to experience significantly more water retention during certain times of her cycle than a woman that has a slightly more balanced set of hormones or hormonal profile. When you combine this higher estradiol and low progesterone and just the hormonal imbalances in general, this can make you feel a little more emotional and less resilient to psychological stress. And that psychological stress can increase water retention via cortisol as well. So it can be a little bit of a nasty feed forward cycle there. Testosterone and derivatives are also considerations when it comes to water retention. Testosterone in normal concentrations in the body typically won't cause excess water retention. So for example, endogenous production in a male client at normal levels, but the variations day to day are pretty minimal for men. And therefore testosterone does not normally contribute to changes in daily body water fluctuations or water retention. However, with exogenous testosterone or superphysiological levels of testosterone, this increases that renin-angiotensin system signaling and aldosterone, causing sodium retention. People using anabolic steroids are therefore going to be significantly more sensitive to changes in dietary sodium as far as body water retention goes, which is sometimes you see people being a little more restrictive with sodium in bodybuilding communities. Testosterone has a mild influence on ADH itself, with increases in testosterone increasing ADH. Now, higher levels of testosterone will mean higher levels of estrogen in men via aromatase, assuming that people aren't taking crazy doses of an aromatase inhibitor. And estrogen has a greater influence on increasing ADH than even testosterone does. So that normal conversion process of testosterone aromatizing into estrogen can contribute to water retention. Now, this can get out of hand, obviously, as those doses climb. But testosterone also increases the capability of glycogen to be stored. So more glycogen means more water retention, and higher levels of testosterone also increase the amount of creatine that can be stored into the muscles. So more creatine, more carbs, more testosterone, more estrogen equals more water. So when we think about that, in many of those cases like creatine, carbohydrate, intramuscular water or glycogen is important for training. This isn't just extracellular water. So it should actually make musculature look more full. It's not necessarily like your average general population client that just feels a little bit puffy when they look in the mirror. And while we're covering hormones, another important one to address is growth hormone. Superphysiological levels or performance-enhancing doses of growth hormone can also cause significant amounts of water retention. And even people who may be taking this for anti-aging reasons, if those IUs start to climb, can lead to increases in aldosterone and ADH. Most of the studies done to examine this water retention effect were on patients with acromegaly. Increased GH secretion through either a GH secreting tumor or another mechanism is kind of how that's been looked at in a lot of studies. In addition to hormones, we also have common client medications that might cause excess water retention. Certain hormonal birth control preparations obviously contain synthetic estradiol. Testosterone replacement therapy can be part of this conversation. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. We have prednisone, certain diabetes medications. So really there's a pretty extensive list of common Western medications that are prescribed by doctors that lead to increases in water retention as well. So as you can see from today's episode, water retention is a multifaceted process. It's not just nutrition, it's not just sodium, it's not just hormones, and it's not just medications, but there are multiple factors that contribute to someone's water retention, maybe that puffy look in the mirror or changes in their scale weight. Obviously, for your clients, you're going to want to make sure we're keeping an eye on nutrition and food intake, since that can clearly contribute to changes in their scale weight and body composition. But for our consistent clients, athletes, performance athletes, and even people who are competing in bodybuilding at a higher level, if they're seeing changes in water retention despite really good adherence, we want to dig deeper into the science of water retention, like we've talked about today, the impact of cortisol, ADH, the renin-angiotensin system, other reproductive hormones, and even medications that are leading to this excess stored water and changes in the look of their physique. If you enjoy learning the deeper science of these hormones and the science of water retention and the connections to nutrition and transformation, as well as overall health, even our discussion around things like blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, insulin sensitivity, and more, or the conversation around reproductive hormone imbalance, estradiol and progesterone, you'll definitely want to check out our functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program inside Metabolism School. You can learn more at metabolismschool.com. I also regularly host monthly workshops where we dive into concepts like this in real time on Zoom, so you can join and ask questions and get some additional instruction outside of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, if it changed your perspective, if you got value, or you plan to use any of this from today's show in your own content, please do me a huge favor and drop a 5-star rating and review to support the show on any major podcast platform where you listen. Chances are someone either shared the show with you or their rating and review helped you find the show when it popped up in your algorithm so that you could hit that download button and listen to your first episode. We don't run tons of ads on the show, and we don't have tons of paid promotions. So this podcast community has always grown from the original listeners, and we've been fortunate enough to reach so many of you around the world over the last several hundred episodes, and I greatly appreciate that. Thanks so much for tuning into today's podcast. I will talk to you guys in the next show.